Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Susan Demas, the executive editor here at Lincoln Square. And joining me today are Carol Leonnig and Aaron Davis. They are the authors of the new book, Injustice: How Politics and Fear Vanquished America's Justice Department. And it just came out this week. Just to give you a little background, Carol is a 5-time winner of the Pulitzer Prize. She is the author of 3 best-selling books, and she is also an investigative reporter at the Washington Post, where she's been for the last 25 years. She won the Pulitzer Prize in 2015 for her reporting on security failures by the Secret Service. She also is part of the Washington Post teams awarded Pulitzers in 2024, 2022, 2018, and 2014. She's also a contributor to MSNBC and has authored several other books as well. And we are also so pleased to have Aaron Davis, who is an investigative reporter for the Washington Post. He has won the Pulitzer Prize twice and has been a finalist 3 times. He was a lead writer and reporter for the Post investigative series Into the January 6th Attack, which won the George Polk Award, the Toner Prize, and with other Post coverage, the 2022 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service. In 2018, he was part of a Post team that won the Pulitzer for investigative reporting. And so we are so thrilled to have both of you here today to talk about your new book. Thank you. I'm sure I could go on and on. I've been reading both of you for years.
Thanks for having us, Susan. We're delighted.
So, we've seen in recent weeks that the DOJ under Trump has indicted some of the president's high-profile adversaries, James Comey, Tish James, and John Bolton. So obviously the timing of your book is apt. But your story of the politicization of the Justice Department really begins a decade ago. So can you take us back to Trump's first term and how that laid the groundwork for what we're seeing today?
Sure. Aaron and I in real time were covering the way that Donald Trump's first presidency came at the Justice Department. He tried to manipulate and bully that institution into doing what he wanted for his personal and political benefit. That included defending his allies and trying to dismiss the charges against Michael Flynn and reduce the penalties and sentencing risks for his longtime political confidant, Roger Stone, and actually pressuring his government to stop investigating him and his campaign for its contacts with Russian operatives and stop investigating him for obstruction of that probe. So he worked really hard to push the Justice Department to do what he wanted in his first term. But what we didn't realize until we did this book reporting, Aaron and myself, was just how scarring and damaging the personalized attacks that Donald Trump landed on investigators and agents by name, how much that shook the firmament, so to speak, of the Justice Department. And though it has a life-standing mantra of without fear or favor, it will pursue evidence of a crime, what Aaron and I learned was fear was starting to creep in then. He may have failed to make the Justice Department his whipping boy in the first presidency, but he was extremely successful in destabilizing it.
Mm-hmm. Aaron, I'd love to hear your perspective as well.
Yeah, so some of the reporting we embarked on, part of the reason we got into this book was, we've been working on everything after January 6th, but, folks were saying, you just don't know, like what's happening now is so much a result of what happened before. Mm-hmm. And, a big part of our reporting is about the delays and how slow people are. And, after January 6th, to really look directly at Trump. And I think, it's hard to put into words what that first Trump term was like. When the sun came up on January 6th, it was a place that was beat down. It was a place where there were far fewer prosecutors doing the day-to-day work of public corruption work than there had been previously. And, they weren't in a good place to handle January 6th. And so, they're scrambling, they're trying to bring in prosecutors and agents to handle all of that. And it took a long time before anybody said, whoa, wait, how are we investigating January 6th? And then even after that, I don't want to go too far ahead of your question, but, so much of everything we've experienced in the past 10 years really goes back to those first days. Andrew McCabe, you remember Andrew McCabe's story of deputy director? We're inside at the very first pages of the book where, the grand jury is hearing the testimony, and they're identifying more with the FBI agents under attack by the president than they are by the folks saying something was done wrong here. The whole place was tipped on its head.
And I know that in the run up to January 6th, and certainly afterwards, there was a lot of criticism about the FBI and the Department of Justice for missing a lot of the run up to this. Some independent journalists, high profile journalists, political critics said, the clues were everywhere, especially if you were on social media, that, they were planning something big. It was out in the open. And, how could the FBI have been caught so flat-footed? But, your book really fills in a lot of those blanks about where these agencies were at going into January 6th, and then the legacy after, which I think is a really important part of the story.
Thank you. Again, Aaron and I, in real time, and then right after, were engaged in a pretty intense excavation of what happened in the days and weeks before January 6th, which was part of that Pulitzer-winning package. But even we were sort of stunned in this book reporting by how much information, how many warnings the FBI received that were so concrete about a domestic terror attack in the planning stages. And yet they did not once investigate further any of the tip line warnings, any of the neighbors who said, my neighbor said this, and he's got a gun, and he's planning this, and here's what he posted. Parler, you may remember that social media platform. An executive inside Parler started warning the FBI about what he saw their own users posting and the worry that it created for them. So while we think, a very good job of describing events for that Washington Post series, this book for the first time really takes you inside the FBI as they are starting to recognize just way too late that this is a very actionable and very violent plot that's brewing.
Just to tack onto that, and everybody in DC was taking their cues from the FBI. And so, the tip comes in about an attack on the Capitol, and the FBI says, we're done investigating this, but just FYI, this was set out there. And so, so Capitol Police, DC Police, everyone didn't take it probably as seriously as they would have if the FBI was more aggressive on those.
Attorneys General and the Department of Justice, are supposed to act independently, even though the president, of course, appoints the Attorney General. As a reporter, I would always chafe a bit to hear people, use terms like the Biden DOJ, and of course he's doing the president's bidding, or, other presidents, Bush, Obama, whatever, not a partisan thing. Because that really is not how things operated and are supposed to operate. But, on day one of Trump's second term, of Pam Bondi's, first day in the office during Trump's second term, she circulated an email to all DOJ staff instructing them that they we're all President Trump's lawyers. Can you talk with us a little bit about the significance of that and how that breaks with precedent? Because we talk a lot in terms of Trump, breaking guardrails and breaking norms, but this is an extremely significant one that it really does, break with tradition, for Democratic and Republican presidents before him.
Yeah, sure. And, I think the best way to make this real for readers, for listeners, is to do two sides of the coin, right? To show two attorneys general in operation. When the House Select Committee was investigating and subpoenaing witnesses for their January 6th probe, Steve Bannon refused to comply with a subpoena to appear and testify and answer questions. And there was a referral that he should be referred to the Justice Department for contempt. Joe Biden, when asked on the South Lawn one day by Evan Perez and other reporters staked out there, said, yeah, he thought Bannon should be prosecuted, or people like him should be prosecuted for defying a congressional subpoena. That was a 5-alarm fire for Attorney General Merrick Garland. We tell a story in the book in which Evan Perez, CNN reporter, contacts the DOJ spokesperson who's trying to have a Friday night with no news and is not thrilled, but has to then call the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General, Lisa Monaco. There's a hastily convened conference call. Merrick Garland says to his spokesperson, read me exactly what the president said. I want to know what he said. And they issue together a statement which emphasizes that the Department of Justice will take its decisions based on the facts and the law and is separate from the White House and does not take its orders from the White House. Full stop, period. It's a pretty testy statement with their own president. Now, fast forward to Pam Bondi. She invites Donald Trump to come to the Justice Department's Great Hall, a very reverent place for many Justice Department employees, where on a fancy recreated stage with a lot of blue velvet curtains, and they happen to cover the Justice Department statues that represent fair justice. Pam Bondi welcomes the president and says that she's so glad to have the chief law enforcement officer in the land here, and she's so delighted to take her direction from the president of the United States. That is, it couldn't be more light and day. And what's interesting is that Merrick Garland, as a young prosecutor and Justice Department official, helped write the rules that created this separation post-Watergate between the White House and the Justice Department to make sure that this mighty power that the department has to investigate and prosecute people wasn't used with any political goal.
Erin, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Carol said it great. I mean, those are great examples. Just even then the first day, Trump comes in and it's very clear what he wants done with the Department of Justice. Even before he takes office, we should prosecute people. We should go after the folks who went after us. He said that on the campaign trail. When the first day Biden introduces Merrick Garland, he says, you don't answer to me. You answer to the American people and to the rule of law. And, it's true that the day that Pam Bondi said that, we work at the directive of the president. We're so pleased to do so. Jaws did drop around the Justice Department, not just in that main justice building, but in ancillary buildings. And it was just so anathema to everything that they all understood as the oath they took to the Constitution and working in the Department of Justice. This work is a calling. And that's something that came through in so many interviews we conducted for this book, is that, these folks could all make more money, have better hours working in private practice, but, they have committed themselves to representing all of us. And, it hurts so many of them, not just those who are in the building now, but who have ever worked there, what's happening inside the Department of Justice right now.
And of course, most of the staff stays on through many administrations, even as the White House changes parties, because they've developed areas of expertise, and they do consider it to be public service and a calling, and the positions are supposed to be nonpartisan. But what we've seen in the second Trump term is that many of the officials that were involved in for instance prosecuting President Trump or his allies for certain cases, just doing their jobs as they were assigned, they've been let go. And so I'd like to talk. I'd like if you could tell us a little bit about the chilling effect, that I'm sure has been felt at the Department of Justice, as well as just the huge exodus of expertise that we're seeing.
Aaron and I have said a couple of times in the last few days that the Department of Justice, even the portion of the book that we write about his presidency before we had to turn it in our book, lost centuries worth of experience. They began losing some of the most important leaders and executives, all career people at the Department of Justice and the FBI within hours of Donald Trump taking the oath of office for the presidency for the second time. People who were the most senior counterterrorism supervisors, who had been here for 9/11, who had seen the rebuild of the Department of Justice to have a more rigorous and fulsome counterterror operation. They were let go or forced out. There were a series of the entire seventh floor leadership of the FBI that were summoned to a room and told, you need to resign or you're going to be fired, as they watched on their own television screens in their office Kash Patel, the incoming FBI director, who was then in a confirmation hearing, say that he did not know anything about any firings going on at the FBI. There were a lot of people who took an early hit, so to speak, in all of these offices who had drawn President Trump's ire because of their role leading these entities that investigated him. Mm-hmm. The problem is that now the worst things our sources predicted about what would happen in a Trump-run DOJ are coming true. People are being prosecuted based on evidence that career prosecutors can consider thin to non-existent. FBI Director Jim Comey, former FBI Director Jim Comey, New York Attorney General Letitia James, both of them on Donald Trump's hit list. There are more people who are under grand jury investigation that are on that enemies list now, and I expect will be indicted. And then you said chilling effect. We've just seen a situation where two prosecutors wrote the word Capitol riot in a sentencing memorandum regarding a person who had been pardoned and then was charged with another crime. They basically used words that are nouns that are true and factual and are caught on camera, and they were pressured to step aside because they had the temerity to basically acknowledge that a riot at the Capitol occurred.
I'm wondering, in whatever comes next, with the Department of Justice, with the FBI under, whoever succeeds President Trump, how long will it take to try and rebuild these institutions with so many career public servants being terminated or resigning? And this, of course, is not unique just to, the Justice Department. We're seeing this in the Department of Health and Human Services and across the board. It's really as many concerns as there were during President Trump's first term. The speed, I think, in which we've seen the dismantling a lot of these departments has been maybe swifter than people expected.
Indeed. I think part of the problem with the Department of Justice is that it's not just people. It's not just hiring back people with a ton of experience, or, you know, letting people work their way up through and have more experience in those positions. We're just losing muscle memory also of how to do things fairly, how to always approach information, in a dispassionate way, and, to let the facts bubble up and make the case decisions based on the facts as they are.
Mm-hmm.
That's such an ingrained part of how the Justice Department works. And it's such a backstop around the country that, there's always this higher power. The United States is so big that somewhere every day something bad happens, right? And when there's a cop or who abuses his power, or a politician who takes a bribe, there's always someone you can look to try to set things right in the Department of Justice historically. And the question is now, how will the American public believe if that's, that there is or is it now tainted in some way for how long, and how many more cases like a Comey or Letitia James before, a majority of the public questions the veracity of all of these cases. And so there's a perception problem, and, you can, what's the saying that, one comment, one bad comment, it sticks with you for how long, to how many compliments, it's like, how many cases does the Justice Department have to do well and do right, and people see done fairly before there's trust in that institution again?
And, I know that one of the things that you detailed in the book was, for instance, whether Egypt secretly funneled $10 million to Trump's campaign. And that's just one example. I'm wondering, how many cases are not being pursued against entities right now because of lack of staff or because of the political bent of the Justice Department, and what the ripple effects are going to be of that, because, we, the people, rely on the Department of Justice as one of our last lines of defense against bad actors at the highest level in this country. And, at this point, it seems reasonable for us to presume that there are many cases that are not being pursued that probably should be.
Yeah, the Egypt case is one that, Aaron and I broke in the pages of the Washington Post, and we unearthed a little bit more for our book. But it is a case in which, pretty serious, the CIA had an informant, which is nothing to sneeze at, who said El-Sisi is instructing Egyptian aides, the president of Egypt, El-Sisi, is instructing aides in September of 2016 to get a $10 million illegal campaign contribution, a la a bribe, to Donald Trump, a time when Donald Trump's campaign was running on fumes, and Donald Trump did not think he was going to win and was resisting his family members and his allies' encouragement to donate more money to his own campaign. After his meeting with El-Sisi, he actually did write a check for $10 million to his campaign around the time that the informant said this money had somehow been ordered up for Trump. That case ultimately died because Bill Barr didn't think it was very legitimate. He warned the FBI director privately that he wanted some serious adult supervision on this investigation, which had started before Bill Barr was the Attorney General. And Jessie Liu, the U.S. Attorney, ultimately rejected FBI after briefing Barr. Originally, she thought it was a good case, or she told them she thought it was a good case. And then after briefing Barr and going to review the documentation, she then told them she was not going to approve their requests to subpoena more of Donald Trump's financial records to figure out, did that $10 million in Egypt that mysteriously left in duffel bags that weighed 200 pounds and were all cash, most of the US dollars that were available in Egypt at the time, that they were not going to be able to get the financial records to figure out, did the duffel bag money somehow end up in Donald Trump's accounts? You asked such a good question about other crimes, other bad actors. that may now have a special carte blanche to engage in more crime. It's hard to imagine they don't feel that way, that bad actors don't feel that the so-called towers and turrets are now down to scope them out, because we've now, under Donald Trump, eviscerated the public integrity section, an elite unit of prosecutors who, after Watergate, were assigned to ferret out officials that were on the take, taking bribes or engaged in violations of the Honest Services Act. That group has dwindled from more than 30 lawyers to now 2, maybe lower now, might be one supervisor. And Trump and his allies at the Department of Justice have also made clear that they're very happy to pardon specific people that are Donald Trump's friends, or that make special entreaties to Donald Trump that are private, that we don't know about. He's now, I believe, just recently pardoned an individual who was at the center of a huge cryptocurrency scam that was involved in trafficking and aiding and abetting a lot of interesting crimes across many countries. What does that communicate to someone else who might want to be engaged in cryptocurrency crime or trafficking or helping use this special secret money system to aid and abet crimes? There's a lot of worry across the country about that if you are an ally of the president's, or if you get in his good graces, there's a different standard of justice for you.
And for us to be transitioning to more of that system where one of personal favors, obviously stands in contrast to what the rule of law is supposed to be in America. And it seems to me that this is more akin to some of the systems that we see in countries like Hungary, for instance. Aaron, I don't know if you feel like comparisons like that are apt, but it certainly seems to be a break with historical precedents here.
Yeah, I heard a story in the course of working on this book about how, there are these kind of rule of law conferences that happen around the world, and in some Latin American countries especially. There was this case, kind of comparative analysis done. Some people from the Department of Justice would go and be part of these, and they would all take turns kind of reading each other's statutes on the books about, how the power breaks down and who reports to who. And the funny thing was, sometimes other countries would come up to the U.S. delegation and they would say, on paper, you don't have an independent justice system. You have one that reports to the president of the United States, and which is obviously elected official. But for almost, our 250-year history here, we've had presidents who have realized that so much of it depends. You are not just the president of your time. You are embodying the presidency and all the best traditions of our country. And, I think people have really felt inside the department that we've talked to, especially with that moment that James Comey was indicted, the kind of the genie is out of the bottle, that, it's true. Ultimately it is a politician who is in the one in charge of the Justice Department, at least on paper. And so we're now kind of realizing how far that can be taken, and where it ends. We will all be along for the ride together here.
I wanted to go back to post January 6th, and I felt like your book presents a real contrast in kind of the agonizingly slow approach of Merrick Garland, the AG under Biden in investigating Trump's role in January 6th, with special counsel Jack Smith's almost recklessness in pursuing, the documents in January 6 cases against Trump. For instance, you write about him making the decision to file his case for the documents case in Florida where he was repeatedly thwarted by Judge Eileen Cannon, who was a Trump appointee. This has kind of all the makings of a Greek tragedy, where ultimately there ended up being no real accountability for Trump or for some of his allies who were involved at the highest levels. Could you walk us through some of the key moments in these investigations and how we got to the place where we are today on that?
Sure. I mean, that's a lot of span of time, Susan, but I'll try. And Aaron will correct and fix what I have to say. But in December of 2020, what we learned and reveal in our book is that an investigator at the National Archives sees that there appears to be a group of swing state fake electors, totally bogus elector certificates that have been submitted. And she's reviewing them and seeing that looks like they're coordinated because they all have the same kind of like fifth grade kind of printer quality to them, and bad headers and bad footers and whatever. So
I'm in Michigan, and so I investigated that at the state level, and it was fascinating to work with reporters in other states and to piece together the similarities. So.
Oh, good. I want to hear more about that. So Michigan is like the, epicenter of one of the episodes we described. But anyway, in December of 2020, she's like going, maybe this is a criminal case. Maybe it's a basic crime. I don't know. Let me touch base with the Justice Department. And they're engaging with her, but on January 8th, they give her their final answer, which is, we don't see a crime here. They're also completely overwhelmed. It's 2 days after the riot at the Capitol, and they have their marching orders, which is appropriate, to investigate this violent crime, to go looking for the individuals who breached the Capitol, broke into it, and some of whom beat and nearly killed police officers. Actually, some police officers did die, and I shouldn't say nearly killed. They did ultimately kill some police officers. So fast forward. I would disagree with your word reckless for Jack Smith. I know that we're just talking back and forth and having a good intellectual discussion, but I think what Jack Smith did differently than Merrick Garland was he recognized there was a clock. He recognized that we don't have any time to waste. Remember, there was no investigation from December 2020 when this archives investigator first proposes it until 15 months later when the FBI and the DOJ actually soldier together and team up to investigate fake electors and the possible illegal interference in the election. 15 months. Merrick Garland, wanting to be cautious, also freezes that case for 2 months right before the midterms in 2022. So Jack Smith, all credit to him, has his work cut out for him when he then must engage in a sprint from November 2022 until he finally brings his cases in the summer of 2023. I have to say, I've covered a lot of criminal cases, some of them far less sophisticated than this, less complex, and certainly not involving a former president. And this was one of the fastest I'd ever seen. He got a fledgling election interference case. He got a nearly done classified documents case, and he brought both of them within 6 to 8 months. So pretty stunning. His decision I'll stop talking for a minute and let Aaron tell you about his decision to bring the case and the charges in the classified documents case, one that was really a slam dunk in Florida.
Well, it was a big moment, and so determinative for the case. We found that there was contrary to I think what's being said now, that this was a witch hunt, that everybody was out to get me, says the current president. We found that sometimes Jack Smith and the Justice Department took steps and made decisions that really were not in their best interest if they were going for the quickest, easiest path for conviction. And that is certainly the case in this classified documents investigation, which was, I think we've said a couple different ways that between, if you're looking at the election one and you're looking at the classified documents, this was the one where the evidence was very clear. The case law was very clear. Taking these documents, holding these documents, not returning them is a crime. People had been court-martialed and put in prison for this repeatedly. But Jack Smith is faced with his decision about whether to do it in D.C., where they'd already had a grand jury and they'd already been investigating it, and people inside the Department of Justice were assuming it was going to be prosecuted in D.C. if it was brought to a grand jury for indictment. But as he learns more and more, so much of the case is centered in Florida, and that the evidence of the boxes being moved around before searches and some of them being whisked away just about the same time that FBI officials are coming in to meet with the Trump's attorneys. That's all in Florida. It's all nested right there. And there was a real concern inside Jack Smith's office that this case could be appealed, that it could be overturned on appeal. And this is where they're thinking 5-6 steps down the road of, we want this to stand the historical test of time, this case. People inside Jack Smith's office are aghast at this, especially one, attorney who had handled classified documents cases. And he said, "Are you effing crazy? This is, we're really going to do this, that this would, we just need to get to a jury the facts that we know them right now in a court." And he was advocating for DC, where so many judges were skilled and practiced in handling classified documents cases. But they went to Florida, and in Florida, we all know that it ended up before Judge Eileen Cannon, and that she ultimately tossed the case. And we still do not have now the final report detailing all of the evidence that Jack Smith found.
And Carol, I appreciate, you pushing back. Obviously, you were the expert, and, my choice of words with recklessness probably was a little strong. His case clearly, as a non-lawyer, did seem extremely persuasive. I mean, just with the photographs that we've all seen of the documents and the Mar-a-Lago bathroom. I mean, it clearly he had many facts on his side. I was specifically referring to just that internal debate over where to file it, because and hindsight is always 20/20. I mean, now it seems like, well, of course, you had a 1 in 2 chance of drawing Cannon, and that was a huge risk. But obviously, there would have been risks in pursuing it in DC as well. So
right. In fact, I love your use of the word risk, because a source told us Jack exposed, in trying to avoid one risk, Jack exposed the case to another. The problem was, as Dave Raskin ended up being prescient in predicting, this is an existential threat to the case if Cannon gets it, and unfortunately, and they walked right into the existential threat.
Right. So ultimately, the Supreme Court ruled last summer that Trump basically had immunity in a very broad sense, shielding him from dozens of criminal charges against him across 4 cases. And I'm wondering, when that ruling came down, did that surprise both of you? And I guess that would be a good place to start, because, certainly then there are many effects on the election and where we're at today.
I mean, it surprised me, but the more important part for the telling of this history is that it really surprised the people inside the Department of Justice. It surprised. I mean, they thought there was going to be some, pushback by the Supreme Court, but the extent to which the Supreme Court gave this wide zone of immunity for any official act by the president, and that so many other things really could be in that gray zone beyond that, of the outer edge of official duties. It impacted not just the election interference case, but would have also presented problems for the classified documents case if it ever got into a trial as well. So, there is in our book, we do take you inside the Attorney General's suite as they're reading this, and people's mouths do drop open. The Attorney General, people close to him, he tells that they must know that they're wrong in this. This cannot be what they really think. He's just dumbfounded by the decision.
So how consequential do you feel that decision was in terms of Trump winning the election, and how did it set the stage for how the Department of Justice has been run in Trump's second term, having such a consequential decision like that on his side?
There are two things to say before the decision, which is the Supreme Court has a lot of power over its own schedule, a lot of options about how to handle a case. And when the immunity, Jack Smith knew that Donald Trump was going to claim some kind of immunity from prosecution, and he asked I was going to say Secret Service, he asked the Supreme Court for an accelerated hearing. Before we even go to the appellate court, we know this is coming to the Supremes. May I have an accelerated hearing, sir? And the answer was no.
Mm-hmm.
And then, however, the Supreme Court in that same time zone granted an accelerated hearing for something else that could potentially harm and hurt Donald Trump and was very time sensitive.
The
Colorado case, which was an argument over whether he should be barred from being on the Colorado ballot as someone who had supported insurrection. And the Supreme Court agreed to hear that as quick lickety-split as they possibly could. The Supreme Court also delayed till the end of their term having an actual oral briefing hearing on the immunity case, and then waited until July of 2023 to give their 2024 to give their decision. All of that made their decision not to grant, this is important in the book, forgive me that I'm going to take you back to the book, Susan, but when the Supremes reject Jack Smith's request for an accelerated hearing on a sped up basis, the chief judge and the judge who is supposed to hear Donald Trump's trial on election interference, Tanya Chutkan, the two of them have been making preparations for trial. They have been making preparations, especially for security in the courthouse. And when they see that the Supreme Court is pushing back this date, they ultimately conclude we can just stop preparing security for the trial because it's unlikely we're going to have a trial. And that is something we didn't know in real time, that even the most serious players in this case who understand how the law works, who understand the Supreme Court schedule, had basically concluded, throw in the towel. There's not going to be a trial.
So I guess just to wrap up, because you have just covered such an enormous amount of ground with this book. Now, every day is kind of a corollary to your book because, the news out of the Department of Justice obviously never stops, but during this administration, every day there may be a new pardon or there, may be a new prosecution and, at very high levels. What are the big stories that both of you are covering now? What are the biggest things that you hope that your readers are looking for in terms of all of these really monumental changes that are coming out of the Department of Justice?
Well, it's a heck of a time to be a DOJ beat reporter, and I really feel for all of the reporters who are, trying to make sense of this department day to day. And we've been on kind of the investigative side, taking this long view of everything that's happened. But every single turn that happens right now just really needs to be documented, and so many are doing such an amazing job doing that. The fear is that we're only at the beginning of a long list of people that Donald Trump has named as folks that should be investigated. We've already seen how obviously Comey and James, but there are others. There's Adam Schiff that he's singled out by name, Senator Schiff from California. So much of what has happened so far inside the Justice Department and the impact of this politicization in this moment has been confined to the main Justice Building in D.C. and some of the very, close by U.S. attorneys' offices or the ones in New York. But what happens now throughout the country? There are 103 different U.S. attorneys' offices, and there's a lot of important cases being handled every day of the week, far from Washington, D.C. And some of the darkness that people have felt that we've talked to for our book about what's happening in D.C. can still say at the same time there's a lot of really good work being done out across the country. The question is, how does that manifest, and which direction does that go? And does more and more things feel like they're being controlled by the main justice and the political appointees?
I'm gonna take your question, Susan, since we're closing up, and just kind of sing a song of praise for the people who have this calling, who remain inside the Justice Department, who are sources of Aaron's and mine, who helped us get inside those rooms for history and share with people how it really went down, and continue to try to do this work without fear or favor, and are hopeful. We've talked to some of them recently, are just hopeful that they can stay on and rebuild this place, restore its credibility, and make sure that it is following the facts rather than the president's political errands.
Well, Carol, Aaron, thank you so much for being here. The book again is Injustice: How Politics and Fear Vanquished America's Justice Department. You can get it in bookstores across the country, and you can also probably catch Carol and Aaron on a variety of programs. They've been everywhere. I'm sure you're very busy with your book tour as well. So thank you for taking all the time that you have today to talk with us here at Lincoln Square.
Thank you so much for having us.
It was our pleasure.